2019 marks 30 years since the final Dalton Bond film was released, Licence to Kill. Since Dalton left the series due to varying complicated legal issues, there have since been two more Bond incarnations. Over this 30-year period, Dalton's Bond has been unfairly mangled by cinema goers and even self-titled Bond fans. In this video, I will go through the two Dalton Bond films and try to make the case in favour of this all too brief era of Bond. Roger Moore had been James Bond since 1973 when Live and Let Die came out. He appeared in 7 total Bond films across a 12-year period. By the time his final film, A View to a Kill, came out, people were tiring of the Bond franchise. Moore was in his late 50s when A View to a Kill came out, and it's clear in the film that he was no longer up to the role. So when Moore left the part, the search was on for a new Bond. The search was extensive, and even included the Irish actor Pierce Brosnan. I wonder where his career went. The producers eventually cast the Welsh actor Timothy Dalton, who was initially reluctant to take on the role, but was soon persuaded. Dalton's first Bond film, The Living Daylights, was briefly thought out to be a prequel. This idea was binned in favour of a simple continuation of the franchise. Living Daylights was directed by regular Bond director John Glenn, who had directed every official Bond outing since 1981's For Your Eyes Only. The Living Daylights includes a classic Cold War plot, taking things very much back to basics after the increasingly outlandish Moore films. The Living Daylights included the return of the Aston Martin, having been absent throughout the entirety of the Moore era. The Aston Martin, any Aston Martin, is intrinsically linked with the 007 franchise. The Living Daylights features classic Bond iconography, while very much feeling like a new chapter in the franchise. So Timothy Dalton's performance is very different from Moore's. Dalton is serious, blunt, but with occasional glimpses of humour. His screen presence is fantastic, and it makes a nice change, having a Bond who can at least do some stunts. Certainly, Dalton is a lot more hands-on and physical in the action sequences than Moore was in A View to a Kill. This makes the action and fight sequences all the more tense and exciting. Bond hadn't included proper fight sequences for quite a while. Unusually for a Bond film at this point, there is only one Bond girl, Cara Milivoy, played by Mariam de Abo. In all honesty, this film is not perfect, and one of the weaker aspects is the Bond girl. Cara is just a bit of a burden for Bond at times and isn't especially useful. The romance aspect isn't all that great either. However, the decision to only have one Bond girl benefits the story greatly, as there is already a lot going on without additional Bond girls throughout the movie. The performances in The Living Daylights are pretty great, with Timothy Dalton and Art Malik being the highlights. The Living Daylights isn't, however, the typical Dalton outing. It does sometimes feel like a reworked Moore script. The film is great, but the definitive Dalton outing came 2 years later with Licence to Kill. From the beginning, Licence to Kill was always intended to be a much darker chapter than previous Bond outings. The Living Daylights, while quite different from the final few Moore films, wasn't too dissimilar to some of the earlier Moore Bonds, and even some of the Connery outings. When he became Bond, Timothy Dalton made it clear to the producers that he wanted to take the character closer to the version that Ian Fleming envisioned in the original novels. To get an understanding of how much darker Licence to Kill is than The Living Daylights, look no further than the BBFC ratings for each film. In the UK, The Living Daylights has a modest PG certificate, which tells you everything you need to know about the tone. Comparatively, Licence to Kill was granted a 15 certificate, as it contains moderate bloody violence and injury detail. I, for one, admire the producers for just making a darker, edgier Bond film, irrespective of the quality. A View to a Kill, which is one of the silliest of all the Bond films, only came out 4 years before Licence to Kill. The darker tone was what was probably needed in the Bond franchise from the moment Dalton was cast. Licence to Kill follows Bond on a personal mission of revenge after Felix Leiter loses his leg to a shark and Leiter's newly wedded wife is murdered by the film's main villain. Licence to Kill is violent and fairly unfiltered. Franz Sanchez, as played by Robert Davi, the main villain, is a cold, calculating drug lord and a brilliant adversary to Dalton's Bond. Licence to Kill was released in July 1989 and was the first Bond film to be filmed entirely outside the UK. Licence to Kill was a bold, different film in the franchise. Being dark and violent is one thing, having a fantastic story is another. Fortunately, Licence to Kill has both. Dalton perfectly suits this darker world. His performance is sharp and serious. The Living Daylights, while a decent outing, feels a bit odd with Bond being more serious. Here, the tone matches very nicely, and you can just sit back and enjoy the film. The film was a moderate financial success, grossing a total of $156 million, which was, however, a drop from the $192 million that The Living Daylights grossed. However, License to Kill made slightly more than A View to a Kill. The thing is, a lot of anti-Dalton fans use the drop in overall gross to suggest that was the reason why Dalton did not return for a third Bond film. However, the reason behind the apparently sudden end to the Dalton era is far more complicated than just that. The delay behind what would become GoldenEye was primarily to do with the legal rights around the Bond franchise. The legal dispute arose when Albert R. Broccoli, the head honcho of the franchise, put Danjaq, the owners of the Bond copyright, up for sale. This unravelled a huge legal battle to retain the Bond studio rights. MGM and United Artists, who had distributed License to Kill and many previous Bond films, were wrapped up in a dispute with Pathé. Dalton's contract ran until 1993, and during this time, he was still on board for at least one more Bond film. There were doubts during this time due to the increasingly fraught legal battle. Anthony Hopkins was being heavily rumoured as the next Bond villain, but production on Bond 17 was moving incredibly slowly. The legal dispute was resolved in 1993, but by this stage, Dalton was very nearly ready to leave the franchise, having waited too long for a follow-up movie. Dalton officially left the role in April 1994, and he was replaced by Pierce Brosnan, who would go on to star in 4 Bond films. So, the Dalton era just sort of fizzled out with no real conclusion. The never-to-be-released third Dalton movie was supposed to be released in 1991, but was consistently and constantly pushed back. The Brosnan era that followed returned to the lighter tone from before, though certainly not delving into the camp frolics of the later Moore installments. The Brosnan era was popular, as it deservedly was. As Dalton succeeded the popular Moore, who starred in 7 films, and was succeeded by the popular Brosnan, who starred in 4 films, it meant that Dalton became somewhat forgotten. For years, Dalton fans were in an uphill struggle and constantly had to defend this all-too-short era. Then, in 2006, the Bond reboot starring Daniel Craig was released. Casino Royale and the overall Craig era have changed people's perceptions of what James Bond can be, and as a result, people in recent years have started to look at the 2 Dalton films more positively. The difference between Dalton and Moore is something more people use as an issue with Dalton. However, I'd argue that is one of the biggest strengths of this era. By being so different from the Moore era, the Dalton era doesn't get compared. In fact, the eras that it most frequently gets compared to are the Connery and Craig eras. So the Dalton era is supremely underrated and well worth your time. Sure, neither of the 2 films are the best in the franchise, but they are certainly memorable, and particularly in the case of License to Kill, distinct and punchy entries. While the Dalton era is not the greatest in the franchise, it is certainly the most underrated. So while I was making this video, I came across the news of the new Bond title. Bond 25 is now no longer known as that, it's now known as No Time to Die, which I think is a fantastic title. It harkens back to previous Bond titles of old, because the Craig era films have sort of been beyond Quantum of Solace, which actually sounds really silly as a title, have been pretty short. Casino Royale, obviously, that harkens back and in fact is the same title of the Casino Royale book, but Skyfall and Spectre, they're one-word films. Now, of course, Spectre refers to the organisation, and I suspect, in fact I know, that before Spectre came out, everyone was thinking, oh, what role will the organisation Spectre, have in this film? What will they do, etc. But with Skyfall, when that title was announced, nobody knew it referred to a house. Did it mean a literal skyfalling? Was it metaphorical? No one knew what it meant. With the Craig films, there's definitely a different style of title. They're generally much shorter and punchier. Compare that to, say, the Brosnan era, where you had Tomorrow Never Dies or The World Is Not Enough. You had much longer titles. Generally, in Bond, titles are longer. You have stuff like Diamonds Are Forever. That's a pretty long title. But then you had short ones like Goldfinger or Dr. No. So it depends. But No Time to Die almost feels like it. That sounds like they've actually announced an unreleased Ian Fleming book that's been found somewhere in Africa or somewhere where you usually find hidden stories and things. Like the Doctor Who missing episodes are usually found in Africa or Korea somewhere. It's like that. They have found an Ian Fleming book and it's called No Time to Die, and it was written in 1956 and it's called No Time to Die. That obviously isn't the case, but it sounds like it is. It sounds like an Ian Fleming story. Now, whether this film, this is unscripted by the way, I'm sure you can tell, whether this film, let's just get that clear, whether this new film is harking back to Ian Fleming style stuff, who knows? I haven't seen it, I haven't finished filming it, but the title says to me that it's going to be, well, it doesn't say anything. It's just a cool sounding title. And again, this is complete nonsense what I'm splurring out right now. But in terms of, it's not a very short title like what we have had with the Craig films. And it's also, yeah, it sounds like an Ian Fleming novel title. And I'm a huge fan of it as a title. Yeah, the film could be crap, it could be amazing. Whatever the film is, I will always, well, no, I can't say that because my mind might change. But at the moment, I'm thinking, yeah, this is a pretty good title.